Hello, Namaskar. This is Firstpost and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma. Our lead story tonight is about the economy, the global economy. It faces three major challenges, and another Cold War could mean losses worth trillions of dollars. We'll tell you what the projection and the analysis is. Meanwhile, in Europe, Viktor Orban pulled off a stunt. He's the leader of Hungary, blocking more aid to Ukraine and its EU membership. He is holding Brussels hostage and walking away with billions. We'll bring you all the drama. Also discussing the decline of Hong Kong, from one of the top financial hubs of the world to the only major market in the red. How China's policies are killing Hong Kong. Is Britain bankrolling Russia's war? Energy giant Gazprom is making millions from British territory, leading to an uproar in London. Can the US have a Hindu president? Vivek Ramaswamy was asked this question. His answer is winning him praises. We'll tell you what he said. In Africa, former French colonies are changing the French language. We'll tell you how. In India, the debate over menstrual leave after a question was raised in Parliament. We'll bring you all of these stories and more. The headlines first. Shocking video from Ukraine. A councillor detonates grenades during a meet, injuring more than 25 people. It is not clear yet how many grenades were detonated or what was the motive for the attack. More than 100 people injured in rush-hour metro collision in Beijing. Preliminary investigation blames the accident on slippery tracks caused by snowstorms. Initially, 500 people were sent to hospital, many of whom were later discharged. Yemen's Houthi rebels strike a cargo ship in the Red Sea. It's the latest such attack in the commercially vital waterway. The Houthis, backed by Iran, have been targeting ships to pressure Israel to agree to a ceasefire in Gaza. Rodrigo Duterte denies making death threats. The former president of the Philippines says he never threatened to kill a congresswoman. He asks prosecutors to not file criminal charges against him. Duterte was president from 2016 to 2022. During that time, he often threatened to kill drug dealers and activists. And it's a tale of two jerseys. 6 shirts worn by Lionel Messi sell for $7.8 million, the second most valuable jerseys ever auctioned. Messi wore them during Argentina's World Cup campaign last year. In India, the BCCI retires MS Dhoni's number 7 jersey. It's Friday and I'm sure you're looking forward to what lies ahead. So let me ruin it for you by saying that a storm is coming. The world economy is in a precarious position. The IMF has sounded an alarm. Geeta Gopinath says a second Cold War is coming and it will cost us trillions of dollars. Gopinath is the deputy managing director of IMF. She says our world is more divided than ever before and this could reverse economic progress. A second Cold War could slash global GDP by 7%, which would mean a loss of $7 trillion and it would be hard to avoid. The global economy faces three major risks: a trade war, China's economic decline, and the increasing military conflicts. Let's start with the trade war. It's a clash between the superpowers, the United States and China. The world's leading economies, together they account for 43% of the global GDP. But since 2018, they've been at odds. That's when US President Donald Trump slapped tariffs on China. Beijing responded in kind, and it went downhill from there. When Biden took charge of the US, he tried to fix it by reversing Trump's tariffs, but it has not happened yet. He met the Chinese leader last month, that's Xi Jinping, and Xi Jinping said he wants stability. But his actions convey the opposite. China is targeting American businesses, raiding their offices and harassing their employees. So normalization does not look like an immediate possibility. And the economic impact is evident. The World Trade Organization gave an assessment. It says global GDP has lost 0.1% due to it. Economists say this figure does not tell the full story. The trade war will have wider ramifications. It is hurting globalization, breaking the global economy, forcing countries to choose camps and realign trade policies. So the trend is not encouraging, and China's decline could accelerate it. And that's the second risk. China is the world's second largest economy, valued at $18 trillion. That's 18% of the global GDP. But of late, China has been stumbling. Growth is sluggish, youth unemployment is at a record high, and loan defaults are surging. By November end, China had blacklisted more than 8 million people. These are people who defaulted on loans, both household and business debt. So China has blacklisted these citizens, 8 million. And the repercussions are serious. China has a law for this. If you're a defaulter, a declared defaulter, you cannot purchase plane tickets. You cannot even make mobile payments. And this is hurting both people and companies. For instance, manufacturers are struggling. Their profits are down by 9% this year. We're talking about some 13,000 companies. Their profits are down. And these companies are not just from China. They're from the US, Europe, Japan, and other leading economies. All of them depend on the Chinese economy. Let me explain how. China's consumer demand has fallen. People are spending less. So factories are churning out fewer goods, and they're reporting a dip in profits. Then we come to the big investors. They're losing money in the Chinese market, so they're pulling it out of China. By August, they'd withdrawn about $10 billion. China's decline is bleeding major economies like Japan. In July, Japan reported a drop in exports. That's because demand from China had weakened. Businesses in Japan got fewer orders. Same with South Korea and Thailand. They've downgraded their economic forecast because both these countries depend on China for business. So China's problem is a global problem. The third risk is the surge in military conflicts. In the past 2 years, we've seen two major wars, Russia versus Ukraine and Israel versus Hamas. Both have jolted the global economy. The Russia-Ukraine war has led to losses of over $2 trillion. And the Israel-Hamas war could cost the world another $1 trillion. That's because it threatens to spread and turn into a wider regional conflict. And remember, these wars are still on, so the costs could rise. So to sum it up, there are three risks: the trade war, China's decline, and the endless military conflicts. They represent uncertainty for the global economy, and uncertainty is anathema to businesses. Unfortunately, there is no immediate solution in sight. On most days, politics is boring. No drama, no surprises, no unexpected twists. But Thursday was not most days. We saw peak drama at the European Union summit in Brussels. We're talking soap opera stuff. The EU heads of state were holding talks, and they had a lot of things on the agenda. But two issues stood out. One was membership for Ukraine. Should the EU begin accession talks with Kiev or not? And issue number two, long-term aid, again for Ukraine. Now, the European Union has 27 members. 26 of them agreed on the first issue. They wanted to begin membership talks with Ukraine. 26 agreed, one of them did not. Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban, he's been leading the country since 2010. He's also Russia's closest partner in Europe. So Orban said the time is not right. His opposition could have threatened the whole thing because in the EU, every member has a veto. Anyone can shoot down any proposal. All it takes is one veto. So what did they do? They innovated. You see, Orban had a clear dilemma. He did not want to vote yes to accession talks. At the same time, a veto was a bad look. 26 versus 1. It would have made him look bad. He would have been left isolated. So reports say German Chancellor Olaf Scholz proposed a solution. He pulled Orban aside and he told him, why don't you step outside during the vote? Grab a coffee. That way you won't have to support or veto. And that's exactly what the Hungarian leader did. He decided not to use his veto. Instead, he just left the meeting room, a bit like abstaining from voting.
I didn't want Hungary to have to take such a bad decision on its conscience, and I said I didn't want to participate. Hungary doesn't want to be involved in this bad decision, so you do it on your own. And so I left the room.
In his absence, the 26 members voted. They agreed to begin accession talks with Ukraine. It was certainly a surprise because most leaders had expected Orban to veto. They thought this summit would drag on. Even President Zelensky of Ukraine, he called it a remarkable result for his country.
This is a truly remarkable result for Ukraine and for the whole of Europe. Another step towards Ukraine's full membership in the European Union. I'm grateful to everyone who supported us and fulfilled exactly what we had agreed upon. No matter what happens, we are working, fighting and building up our strength. The strength of our beautiful Ukraine.
Let's talk timetables now. How long will accession take? It can vary from country to country, but the average is around 4 years. And in this period, a lot could go wrong. Some 70 unanimous decisions will have to be taken at various stages, 70. And Hungary can block any of them. In fact, Viktor Orban has threatened to do just that. He says he can halt the accession later on. So it's not a done deal yet, which brings us to the issue number 2, that of aid. The European Union was seeking $54 billion for Ukraine. It's a mix of loans and grants. Again, a unanimous decision was needed, but this time, Hungary did veto. Orban said Ukraine cannot be given $54 billion. Why? Because he says Kiev is not a member yet, and it's a fair argument. But the real reason is not that. Orban wants more money from the EU, as simple as that. He wants funds to tighten his borders, to keep migrants out of Hungary. The EU did make some concessions before this summit. They unlocked $11 billion for him. They gave Viktor Orban $11 billion. But now Orban wants more, around $22 billion more. If he gets that money, he could approve the aid. It's a big blow for Ukraine. They're running out of aid from the United States. They needed Europe to step up. Now, all the headlines talk about the accession vote, but frankly, aid was a bigger issue for them. Just think about it. An EU membership may come in 2027 or 2028, years away, maybe even later. But by then, what will be the situation in Kiev? Will the current regime remain? Will Kiev still be standing, or will Russia have won the war? So the immediate requirement was funding, and on that, the EU has failed. What's the next step now? Well, there are two options. One is to go bilateral. Each EU member can donate the money individually. It's likely to be more expensive and complicated. The other way is to wait until January. That's when EU leaders are meeting again next month. And they will once again discuss the aid for Ukraine. If Orban gets his money by then, he may support the funding. Or maybe step out for coffee. If not, it will be a repeat of yesterday. So the Hungary-Ukraine episode was dramatic, but it wasn't the only one that took place yesterday. 2 other countries have been trying to join the European Union, and they made some headway too. Moldova and Georgia. And this is very important because both these countries are former Soviet states, Moldova and Georgia, and both are now looking to embrace the EU. Moldova applied last year at the same time as Ukraine, and Georgia followed soon after. Now, Georgia is a small country with less than 4 million people, located at the border of Asia and Europe between the Caucasian Mountains and the Black Sea. Georgia also borders Russia. In fact, like I said, it's a former Soviet state. Also the birthplace of one of its most famous leaders, one of the most famous Soviet leaders, Joseph Stalin. He was born in Georgia. So this was a communist stronghold. But yesterday, it became an EU candidate, and that is quite a shift in political affiliation.
With great pride and great joy, I congratulate you on the historic decision. Georgia has become a candidate country for EU membership. Congratulations to all. I want to congratulate every citizen on today's historic day. This is truly a victory for our country and our people.
Georgia's Prime Minister called it a victory. It is a defining moment when a former Soviet nation gets the EU nod. And Georgia's candidature did not come easy. Their president was quite blunt about this.
We, Ukraine, Georgia and Moldova, are the examples of what it means to fight for freedom, to fight for Europe, for those common values that we share with Europe and stay true to them. And this is what we are celebrating today. The sped up process and the events taking place in Brussels today would not have happened without the fight and the devotion of the Ukrainian people and the cruel war that has been raging for almost 2 years now. For this, we need to express our deepest gratitude.
She says Georgia would not have become an EU candidate had it not been for the Ukraine war. And she has a point. In many ways, Georgia was the first Ukraine. It started pivoting towards the West in the early 2000s. In 2006, Georgia worked out a deal with the EU, an action plan to move closer to the bloc. And then in 2008, Georgia began cozying up to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, Russia's sworn enemy. Georgia wanted to join both the EU and NATO, the Western Economic Group and the Western Military Bloc. It was a clear rejection of its past. Moscow did not like it. So in 2008, Russia struck Georgia. It began a war over a breakaway region, a region that is internationally recognized as a part of Georgia. But it has been de facto independent since the 1990s, and Russian troops have been present there for decades, acting as peacekeepers. So in 2008, when Georgia showed interest in joining NATO, suddenly tensions flared up in this province. Fighting broke out, and Russia sent its forces into battle. Does that sound like coincidence? Well, Russia directly engaged in war against Georgia, and that put an end to Georgia's plans to joining NATO. Because NATO says an attack on one member is an attack on all. So they don't really want new members who are already fighting wars, especially against Russia. That meant Georgia's NATO ambitions were dashed. Moscow's play prevented a NATO country cropping up at its border. Does all of this sound familiar? It should, because this is how the Ukraine war started. Ukraine wanted to join NATO and the EU, and that's where a war with Russia began. But this time, the West acted differently. They did not abandon Kiev, they threw it a lifeline. And even though NATO membership seems far off, Ukraine is now closer to joining the EU, and with it, Moldova and Georgia. It's not a done deal yet. An EU candidate status is only the first step. Countries need to change their laws, change their systems to conform with EU guidelines. It could take years. Plenty of time for Russia to make counter moves. In fact, it might already be making some. Reports say Russia is setting up a new naval base in one of Georgia's want-away regions. So Moscow still has some tricks up its sleeve, though losing ground in 3 former Soviet states is a setback. Let's talk about Hong Kong now. We've seen multiple headlines coming out from Hong Kong. None of them looks good, though. Just take a look. Hong Kong universities shrivel in Beijing's grip. India overtakes Hong Kong as the 7th largest stock exchange. Hong Kong elections fall flat with record low turnout. And the latest one, Hong Kong offers bounties on overseas activists. These are all recent headlines. All of them tell the same story. Hong Kong is not what it used to be. It is on the decline. We'll start with the bounties. The latest headline, Hong Kong is seeking information about 5 activists. All of them live abroad. If the information leads to arrest, a reward will be given. How much? Around $128,000. Now, just to be clear, these are not drug dealers or human traffickers. We're talking about activists, people who wanted democracy in Hong Kong. They've already been driven out of the city. Many of them now live in the US or the UK. They face charges under the national security law. Both London and Washington have condemned the bounty, but Beijing says it is necessary.
By cheering on these anti-China individuals that are bringing havoc to Hong Kong, the United States and Britain are exposing their malicious intentions in messing up Hong Kong. What I want to emphasize is that Hong Kong is China's Hong Kong. Hong Kong affairs are purely China's internal affairs.
It's not just activists, though. Investors and companies are also fleeing Hong Kong, especially American ones. The number of US firms has fallen for 4 years in a row. Last year, only 1,258 of them remained. That's the lowest since 2004. Hong Kong used to be the regional headquarters for most multinational companies. It was the Asian nerve center, but not anymore. MNCs with head offices in the city have dropped 8.4%. That's from 2019 to 2023. These MNCs have also downsized. They've shifted around 30% of their staff out of Hong Kong. And where are they now? Mostly in Singapore. Same with investors and fund managers. Hong Kong's banks used to manage vast quantities of assets. But now assets under them are down by 15%. Wealth managers say inflows are down by 80%. Imagine that, an 80% fall in funds in 1 year. All of this has pushed Hong Kong's stock market into a tailspin. Take a look at this. This is how major indices have performed in the last 5 years. America's Dow Jones up by 65%. India's Sensex is up 100%. South Korea's Kospi is up 24%. The Japanese Nikkei is up 63%. The UK's FTSE is trading 13% up. Even China's Shanghai Composite is 17% up. Now look at the Hong Kong index. 34% down. The only major market that is in the red. What does that tell you? Investors have lost faith in Hong Kong. They're pulling money out of the city. And why just investors? Even tourists are not visiting like they used to. By the end of this year, 30 million tourists will have visited Hong Kong, which may sound like a lot. But in 2018, 65 million people had visited. So this is less than half. So to recap, companies are pulling out, investors are fleeing, and tourists are staying away. I guess the obvious question is why? In one word, China. Let's take you back in history. In 1997, the UK returned Hong Kong to China. Back then, Beijing made a promise. Hong Kong would get 50 years of autonomy. They could keep their capitalism and democracy. It was called One Country, Two Systems. But China broke that promise. Most of the trouble started in 2019. That's when massive pro-democracy protests broke out in Hong Kong. China cracked down with an iron fist. They also framed a new law for Hong Kong, a national security law. It called for strict punishment for anything anti-China. Activists could be extradited to Beijing, election candidates could be banned, and critical media could be raided. Basically, one country, two systems was over. That was strike one. Strike two was the pandemic. China enforced zero COVID measures in Hong Kong, so MNCs were caught in a bind. They had millions of dollars flowing through the city, but one fine day, the government shut shop. So the companies realized one thing: Hong Kong is not reliable. They had to spread their businesses out. All of this led to Western sanctions. Just look at the city's chief executive. His name is John Lee. He took charge in 2022, but before that, he was Hong Kong's security chief. Lee played a key role in cracking down on protesters. So even today, he is sanctioned. He cannot travel to most Western countries, meaning he cannot lobby for his city abroad. No trade expos, no economic forums, not even official visits. Most business leaders point to a change in the atmosphere. In the 1990s and 2000s, Hong Kong was free. It was China, but not China. You could bring capital easily. Taxes were low. Surveillance was not an issue. And of course, China was not breathing down your neck. Today, that is not the case. Even foreigners are not exempt from the national security law, a law that carries the death penalty. Things are so bad, some business leaders carry burner phones in Hong Kong. They use and throw them away. That's the fear of Chinese surveillance. You can't do business in such a setting, which is why companies are fleeing the city. The question is, can Hong Kong recover? Well, the government is betting on Chinese help. Around 77% of their stock market's value is from Chinese companies. It's inching towards a monopoly. But the problem is, China is not doing any better. They have their own problems. So if you think about it, Hong Kong is the perfect example of China's toxicity. Things were fine until the city was autonomous. Once that ended, so did the growth. We've heard about the Midas touch. Well, this was the touch of death. So Hong Kong is losing its sheen. Perhaps it could take a lesson or two from Russia. The Russian economy is gripped by sanctions. Many industries have been crippled except for one, the oil and gas industry. It is still making money hand over fist, even from its worst critics in the West. Russian energy giant Gazprom is still doing business with the UK. It operates a gas field in Europe. Last year, Gazprom earned over $45 million from there. The revelation has led to an uproar in London. Is the UK funding Russia's war? Our next report explores.
Last month, Russia's finance ministry made an announcement. Moscow had achieved a new milestone. Russia's oil and gas revenues made a new record. In October, Moscow earned over $17 billion, their highest since April 2022. This revelation was an indictment for the West. Their sanctions regime remains ineffective. Global oil prices are rising, and Russia has capitalized on the surge. Western powers have tried to limit Moscow's earnings. They had introduced a price cap, a ceiling of $60 per barrel, but it has proved to be ineffective. These failures highlight the limitations of sanctions. Russia can still exploit many loopholes. One of them is this gas field. It is called Silimanite. The Silimanite field is spread across British and Dutch waters. Russia's Gazprom has rights to use it. They started production from Silimanite in 2020. For 3 years, Gazprom has gone about its business here, despite the war in Ukraine and Western sanctions. Wintershall, a German company, is Gazprom's partner in this project. Together, they supply gas to Europe. The gas is produced at Silimanite and supplied to the region through the Netherlands. Last year, the Russian-German joint venture did good business. They earned over $45 million from this field. This disclosure has caused an uproar. British politician Ed Davey is the leader of the Liberal Democrats. He has put Gazprom under a spotlight. Davey says Gazprom is drilling gas from the UK's territory, and this is totally unacceptable. But Gazprom isn't doing anything illegal. Even though the UK has sanctioned Gazprom executives, the energy giant itself faces no sanctions. Gazprom still supplies gas to Europe. In fact, the demand has only risen. The European Union has imported a record volume of gas from Russia. From January to July, imports to the region shot up by 40%. This surge was driven by two European nations in particular, Belgium and Spain. They were among the biggest buyers of Russian gas in the world. China came first. Belgium and Spain were ranked second and third. Europe still remains addicted to Russian gas. 12% of the EU supply still comes from Russia, even though the bloc has vowed to stop Russian imports. The EU has set a deadline. It wants the ban enforced by 2027. Moscow remains skeptical. It says Brussels won't succeed in this endeavor.
This is yet another attempt to create a pseudo-legal scheme to harm the competitiveness of our country's economy. They won't be able to achieve this. They couldn't do it before, and they won't be able to do it now.
The momentum is clearly in Moscow's favor, and despite their best attempts, Europe is far from weaning itself off from Russian energy.
Gazprom isn't the only Russian entity making money. So is Wagner, the private military company once led by Prigozhin. In June, Prigozhin revolted against Putin. In August, he was dead. It raised a lot of questions about Wagner's future. But 3 months on, Wagner seems to be thriving, especially in Africa. A new report is out. It says Wagner earned $2.5 billion from trade in African gold. This is since the war broke out in 2022. So if you calculate, that's around $114 million every month. That's a lot of money. Money that is believed to be filling up Russia's war chest. So is Putin profiting from African gold? Our next report tells you.
Температура плюс 50. Все как мы любим.
That was Vivek Prigozhin, the former Wagner chief, a man who revolted against Putin and then died in a plane crash under suspicious circumstances. This is his last video clip before his death. It was from Africa. Prigozhin can be seen with a rifle, dressed in military overalls, calling for justice for African nations. The Wagner Group is a private military company. It's present in many continents, but in Africa its foothold is unmatched. Wagner is present in several countries, mainly Central African Republic, Mali, Sudan and Libya. Its presence here is built on two things: blood and gold. African nations give Wagner security contracts. Wagner, on the other hand, keep their regimes in power. They provide security, military training, and protect natural resources, all for money and more resources. Now, a report has shed light on its operations. It's called the Blood Gold Report. It says that Wagner and Russia earned around $2.5 billion from trade in African gold since the war broke out in Ukraine in 2022. Which means every month since the war, it has provided revenue worth $114 million. This includes money from the control of gold mines, payment in gold, and gold smuggling as well. It starts with the Central African Republic. Here, Wagner controls the Decima gold mine. It's the largest gold mine in the country. It produces $290 million worth of gold every year. A company linked to Wagner was given the exclusive rights of this mine. In return, Wagner helps CAR's regime stay in power. Then there's Sudan. Wagner here controls the unprocessed gold market. This is through an unnamed refinery. So a Russian company controls this refinery. This allows Wagner to become the biggest buyer of unprocessed Sudanese gold. In 2021, as much as 32.7 tons of Sudanese gold went missing. It was worth around $2 billion. Reports suggest it was flown to Russia. Accounts suggest military planes shipped processed gold out of the country. In Mali, the Wagner have it easier. They don't need to convert gold into cash. Mali has international mining companies, so there is already cash. Thus, the Wagner has a cash for security deal with a junta, earning something around $10.8 million monthly. And all of these exchanges are murky. Russia and Wagner are both sanctioned, so they have to bypass them. Like in Mali, Wagner is not directly linked to the gold production. So what did Wagner do with this gold? Reports suggest it was laundered into international markets. That way, it provided billions in revenue for Russia. We don't know how the money was used, but many suggest it could be directly or indirectly financing Russia's war in Ukraine. So while the death of Prigozhin did cast a shadow on Wagner's future, just 3 months later, the Wagner Group is thriving, and Putin's war chest just keeps growing, all thanks to their presence in Africa.
What does it take to be the President of America? Nowadays, the bar is low, age is clearly not an issue, neither is impeachment or criminal cases. But what about religion? The US is a majority Christian country. Around 63% of its population is Christian. So can a non-Christian effectively lead the country? That was a question put to Vivek Ramaswamy this week. He's a Republican candidate for president. He's also an Indian American. Ramaswamy was born in the US, but he's a Hindu. So can he be an effective US president? This is what he was asked. Listen to his answer. I'm quoting, "I am a Hindu. I won't fake my identity. Hinduism and Christianity share the same value set in common. My faith teaches me that God puts each of us here for a purpose, that we have a moral duty to realize that purpose. That God works through us in different ways, but we are still equal because God resides in each of us." It's a good answer. A lot of people have praised Ramaswamy on the internet. They appreciated his honesty. He admitted that he is not the best president to spread Christianity, but he also said that is not the president's job. Again, true. A president's job is to make policy, to give people safety and prosperity. Their religion should not be a factor, at least in a secular country. But who are we kidding? Of course it helps. Ramaswamy may be proud of his Hinduism, but his campaign is rooted in conservative Christian values. He opposes abortions. He supports abstinence before marriage. He also says there is one God. And we don't blame him. American politics is very much about Christianity. Let me explain. The US Constitution does not mention God, but their Declaration of Independence does. So do most state constitutions. A 2017 study looked at the number of mentions, and here's what they found. God is mentioned 116 times in state constitutions, Creator 7 times, Providence 3 times, and Christian 7 times. No prizes for guessing which God they're talking about. Same in the US Congress. 88% of US lawmakers identify as Christian. But like I mentioned, only 63% of the general population is Christian. What about US presidents? Most of them were Christians. Only 3 of them are doubtful. Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and Andrew Johnson. Their affiliation is unknown. The rest were Christians. Also, there's just one religious federal holiday in the US, and that is Christmas. What does all of it tell you? Being a Christian does help in American politics. And don't get me wrong, it does not mean that religious minorities are in crisis or they're being systematically denied access. It's just a key factor in US politics. Just look at the last elections. Joe Biden released an entire campaign video on faith. Take a look.
Personally, for me, faith, it's all about hope and purpose and strength. And for me, my religion is just an enormous sense of solace. I go to Mass and I say the Rosary. I find it to be incredibly comforting. And Kierkegaard said, faith sees best in the dark.
I'm sure you saw the pictures. Biden in a church, Biden with the Pope, Biden with the Rosary. He clearly tapped into the religious vote bank. And it wasn't just Biden. His rival Donald Trump did the same. He said Biden would be, and I'm quoting, Biden would hurt God if elected. Listen to this.
He's following the radical left agenda. Take away your guns, destroy your Second Amendment, no religion, no anything, hurt the Bible, hurt God. He's against God, he's against guns, he's against energy, our kind of energy.
They're doing this for a reason. 20% of Americans want their president to have very strong religious beliefs. 32% of them prefer somewhat strong religious beliefs. My point is, they like religious presidents, which is why Vivek Ramaswamy keeps getting these questions. But has that affected his popularity? Well, Ramaswamy is number 4 in the polls. He's got 5% support. Donald Trump is way ahead at 61%. I guess religion or not, that's a losing race. But kudos to Vivek Ramaswamy for being proud of his identity, for not downplaying his religion. It makes for good headlines, if not a winning strategy. Now let's turn our attention to Africa, specifically France-Afrique, meaning the former French colonies in the African continent. They're witnessing a revolution. Not another coup, but a sort of cultural revolution. These former French colonies are overthrowing an unusual oppressor, the French language, or rather the traditional proper version of French. And here's something you may not know. Of all the French speakers in the world, Africa is home to about 60%. And in a few decades, this will go up to 80%. 80% of the world's French speakers will be Africans. The Democratic Republic of Congo already has more French speakers than France. So obviously, local African languages are influencing their French and changing the French language. Here's our report.
What comes to your mind when you think of the heart of French culture? Perhaps you think of the Eiffel Tower or the Arc de Triomphe, maybe a moonlit stroll along the bank of the Seine River. But have you ever thought of a walk beside the Congo River in Kinshasa instead? Maybe you should, because in a few years, the DRC's capital, Kinshasa, may become the world's most populous French-speaking city. The French may have officially left the African continent a few decades ago, but they left their language behind in their former colonies. And France-Afrique is giving the French language an African twist. The word pain in French means bread, but in Côte d'Ivoire or Ivory Coast, pain also means boyfriend. Choco, the short form of chocolat or chocolate, is now a euphemism for sweet. So men should be taking it as a compliment if they're ever referred to as chocolate bread in French. This is just one example of how the French language is changing, and a lot of it is due to African nations taking ownership of their former colonizers' language. Today, 60% of all French speakers live in Africa, and that number will keep growing. Europe is graying while Africa is a young continent. In the next few decades, 4 out of 5 French speakers will be based in Africa. The twist to the language isn't unique to African French. Most former colonies have made their oppressors' language their own. Look at India and English. Have you ever heard of the term prepone? It's the opposite of postpone, short for bringing some predetermined arrangement forward in time. This handy little word isn't technically proper English. It's an invention by Indians, and the English language seems far less cumbersome because of it. There are, of course, numerous other examples. Terms like doing the needful, passing out of school or college, or going out of station are all Indianisms. In much the same way, Africanisms are bound to leave the French language a bit more joyful. Ironically, France, the country which coined the term lingua franca, may linguistically get left behind, especially considering some of their more recent moves. Last month, French President Emmanuel Macron inaugurated one of his most expensive cultural projects, the International City of the French Language. It's a museum located in northern France, one that's dedicated to preserving classical French. The museum may actually be a good idea, because of how Africa has been reacting to its colonial past lately. Some former French colonies have moved to remove French as their official language. Mali and Burkina Faso have done it this year. Others may follow. But even if they don't remove it, the former African colonies will continue putting their spin on the French language. So maybe Macron's museum will be the last place to find classical French. As for Africa, the French there will remain a little sweeter, or should we say choco.
Our next story is about two words. They have stirred up an old debate in India: menstrual leave. It gives employees or students time off when they experience menstrual pain or discomfort. This week, the topic came up in the Rajya Sabha, the upper house of the Indian Parliament. The question was, has the government taken any measures to make menstrual leave compulsory? Smriti Irani responded. She is the Union Minister for Women and Child Development. Listen to what she said.
Menstruation and a menstrual cycle is not a handicap. Neither it's a natural part of a woman's life journey. Given that women today are opting for more and more economic opportunities, I will just put my personal view on this, sir. I am not the officiating ministry. We should not propose issues where women are in some way denied an equal opportunity just because somebody who does not menstruate has a particular viewpoint towards menstruation.
These remarks have kicked up a storm, which is not surprising. The world over, this debate has been on. Many are against it, even those who menstruate themselves. Some are in favor, and policies are few and far between. Japan, Indonesia, South Korea, Vietnam, and Zambia have a menstrual leave policy. This year, Spain joined the club, the first among European nations. In 1992, Bihar became the first state in India and one of the first few worldwide to introduce a menstrual leave policy for employees. This year, Kerala allowed the same for college students. Their argument is simple: more than half the women are in pain when they menstruate. They pop a pill or they take some rest and go about their business. But they're still in discomfort. In some cases, the problem is manageable, and others it becomes debilitating. 25% of the women who menstruate can experience severe cramps. Some studies say they can be as painful as a heart attack. Some women can have fainting spells. Some may even require hospitalization. Now, these are the worst case scenarios, but even on the best days, periods hinder productivity. Research says employees lose about 9 days' worth of productivity a year. In the Netherlands, 14% women took time off during periods. In India, 40% girls miss school during periods. So if you know the problem, if it happens every month, if it affects a major chunk of your population, why not introduce a policy that eases the suffering? Because the debate of period leave is a nuanced one. And here is the flip side. Across the world, year on year, women have fought to be seen as equals. The progress has been slow, but it exists. A menstrual leave policy could set this back. It could reinforce gender stereotypes. It could lead to discrimination. It could affect how we see women in the workplace. With a period leave, women may be seen as less committed or productive compared to their male counterparts. It could harm their career prospects. And this is risky for a country like India. In terms of workforce, women's participation has been shrinking. India is already among the 20 lowest nations in the world. As for education, 20% of Indian girls drop out of school after reaching puberty. Let's say a menstrual leave policy is implemented. There is a high chance it will not work. It will not work. We saw this in Japan. It introduced a period leave policy in 1947. Since then, since 1947, only 0.9% women have actually taken a leave. In India too, women may be reluctant because taking a period leave could be like wearing a scarlet letter. As it is, this is a taboo topic in India. Talking about it is just the tip of the iceberg. Menstruating women cannot touch certain foods, enter their kitchens, sometimes even their homes. In some communities, they're shunted to what are called menstrual huts. When menstruating, many Muslim women are not allowed to offer prayers. Hindu women are not allowed to enter temples. Over half of Indian women do not have access to sanitary napkins. Those who do receive them in black poly bags from shopkeepers. Many Indians, especially men, have little education about menstruation, and those who do crack jokes about mood swings or time of the month. Periods have already been used to embarrass, discriminate and abuse women. So my point is very simple. The policy of menstrual leave has its benefits, but to think that it will work on the ground is to be divorced from reality. Women may need a period leave, but first they need more jobs. They need better education, sanitation, health and lesser stigma. Women already have enough battles. If one policy makes the fight harder, our last story tonight is about gig workers, your delivery riders, your Uber drivers. They fuel a multi-billion-dollar economy, but the conditions they work in are often a problem. Plus, there is no one set of rules. Usually, they're at the mercy of their company. So Europe has come up with a solution, a new legislation. It's a historic deal for the European Union. Once approved, gig workers will be reclassified. They can be registered as full-time employees, which would mean a higher pay and labor rights like insurance and other protections. So will this change Europe's gig economy? Our next report explores.
The European Union has finally reached a deal that could change the life of 5.5 million workers. People who deliver food, people who offer rides, people laboring on digital platforms, people who fuel the gig economy. For years, they haven't had conventional workers' rights, but that could change soon. It's called the Platform Worker Directive. The plan came originally in December 2021. It was to boost protections for gig workers. The EU mulled on it for some time, and it looks like after 2 years, they've reached a consensus. A bid to stop the gig economy exploitation. If approved, it could reclassify them as full-time employees. That means many things, such as a minimum wage, paid leave and unemployment benefits. Also, there will be transparency. Platforms will have to tell workers if they are being monitored or even managed by algorithms. The EU says these 5.5 million workers are not gig workers but permanent employees, so they must have the benefits. The companies, however, disagree. Digital platforms have a problem with this, the likes of Uber and Deliveroo. They say workers have full autonomy and flexibility. They can work whenever they like, which doesn't make them permanent employees, but the EU is not buying their claims. Will this help revamp the gig economy? The deal is meant to clean up the grey areas, the ones that exist between these platforms and their employees, the grey area of legislation. It would clear up the employment status of millions, give them insurance, give them rights, and save them from abuse. But for companies, it will be a costly exercise. They will have to spend billions for these rights, which is why they are likely to challenge it. Either way, member states too need to sign up for it, which means this could take some time. On paper, it's a historic deal, but there could be some compromise in the coming days, especially with companies fighting back.
And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. In Russia, blizzards sweep across Moscow, leading to one of the biggest snowfalls in 6 decades. In Paris, streets glitter with lights and decorations as the French capital gears up for Christmas. And is it fake or is it cake? That's the only question you will be asking at this Bengaluru cake show, which displayed a plethora of life-sized cakes. Finally, we're taking you back in history. On this day in 1978, then US President Jimmy Carter announced that Washington would recognize the communist regime in China. Until then, the US only had ties with the regime in Taiwan. Relations have seen many ups and downs since then, with talks of a new Cold War nowadays. We're leaving you on that note. Thanks for watching. Have a good weekend.